Welcome back to Irregular Mind. You are listening to US History, Understanding This Country. If you have been following along, we have traced America's journey from the early days through the revolution, which has culminated to the Constitutional Convention. This episode is an extension to the last one. We discuss about how the Constitution was built and the Constitution itself. By the summer of 1787, the Constitutional Convention was in full swing. The delegates had already decided to scrap the Articles of Confederation and build an entirely new government. But now, they had a much bigger problem. Nobody could agree on what the government should look like. At the heart of the debate was one crucial question: how should states be represented in Congress? The answer would determine how power was distributed in the new government, and the fight over it nearly tore the convention apart. Two competing plans were proposed: the Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan, and neither side was willing to back down. But out of this fierce debate came the Great Compromise, a decision that shaped the structure of Congress and continues to define American government today. The Virginia Plan proposed by James Madison was designed with big states in mind. It called for strong national government with three branches: executive, legislative, and judicial. But the most controversial part was how the legislative branch, the Congress, would be structured. Madison's plan suggested a bicameral legislature, meaning two houses of Congress. But here is where it got tricky. Representation in both houses would be based on the population. That meant larger states like Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts would have more votes than smaller states. To big states, it made perfect sense. More people meant more representation. But small states saw this as a direct threat. They feared they would be overpowered and ignored. And so they pushed back. The small states weren't having it. They feared that if representation was based on population, the larger states would dominate national decisions, leaving smaller states like New Jersey, Delaware, and Rhode Island powerless. So, William Paterson of New Jersey introduced a counter proposal, the New Jersey Plan. This plan suggested that Congress should only have one house and every state, regardless of size, would get only one vote. For small states, this plan protected their voice in the new government. But for large states, it was completely unfair. Why should tiny Rhode Island have the same voting power as a massive Virginia? Neither side was willing to budge. The big states wanted representation based on population, the small states wanted equal representation, and the convention was at a standstill. That's when Roger Sherman of Connecticut stepped in with a compromise. Sherman's plan, that we now call the Great Compromise, blended the two ideas together into a system that gave both big and small states something they wanted. He proposed the Congress should have two houses: the House of Representatives, representation based on population, favoring big states; the Senate, equal representation for every state, favoring small states. This meant the big states got more influence in the House, where laws about money and spending would be decided, while small states got equal power in the Senate, where major national decisions like treaties and appointments were made. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was the only way forward. On July 16, 1787, the compromise was approved by just one vote. This decision saved the Constitutional Convention from falling apart and created the system we still use today: a two house Congress, balancing power between states of all sizes. The Great Compromise shaped the foundation of American government. It ensured that the big states couldn't completely overpower small states, while still giving larger populations more influence. It also showed that the Constitution was built on negotiation and compromise. Nothing was easy. Every decision required debate, argument, and balancing competing interests. But the debates weren't over yet. Even with the structure of Congress settled, one of the biggest and most controversial issues was still looming: how enslaved people would be counted in this new system. Would they be recognized as part of the population or ignored completely? That's what we'll tackle next. Should the enslaved people be recognized as people or just still treated as a property? The debate over slavery was one of the most difficult, morally complex, and politically charged issues of the entire convention. And the way delegates handled it would have consequences that shaped America for generations to come. The question boiled down to whether we should continue slavery or not. By 1787, slavery was deeply entrenched in the Southern economy. The real fight at the convention was about political power. Southern states where slavery was widespread wanted enslaved people to count as part of their population. Why? Because population determined the representation in the House of Representatives. More people meant more seats in the Congress, which meant more power for the South. But northern states saw right through this. They pointed out the obvious hypocrisy. You treat enslaved people as property, not citizens, so why should they count when it comes to political representation? If enslaved people are counted, southern states would gain more influence in Congress, and that influence would be used to protect and expand slavery. Northern states pushed back. Some delegates, particularly those from Pennsylvania and Massachusetts, opposed slavery entirely and wanted it abolished. Others were not against slavery itself, but didn't want the South to gain an unfair political advantage. The two sides were completely deadlocked, and as they had done before, the delegates reached a compromise, one that was deeply controversial even at that time. The final decision became known as the Three-Fifths Compromise. It stated that, for purpose of representation and taxation, enslaved people would be counted as three-fifths of a person. Let that sink in. Not fully ignored, not fully counted, just three-fifths. This meant that for every five enslaved people, only three would be counted towards the state's total population. The South got more representation than it would have if enslaved people were ignored entirely, but not as much as it would have if they were counted fully. The North, though unhappy with the compromise, accepted it because it kept the convention from collapsing. Without it, southern states threatened to walk away, which could have meant no constitution at all. It was a decision made for the sake of unity, but one that embedded the injustice of slavery into the US Constitution. The Three-Fifths Compromise wasn't just about numbers. It had long term consequences that shaped American politics for decades. It gave the South more political power, allowing pro slavery states to dominate the government for much of the early 19th century. It delayed the fight over slavery, making it a ticking time bomb that would eventually explode into the Civil War. It was one of the biggest contradictions in the American history, a constitution that spoke of liberty and democracy while also protecting a system of human bondage. Some delegates knew this was a deep moral failure. Governor Morris of Pennsylvania called slavery the curse of heaven on the states where it prevailed. Others, like George Mason of Virginia, believed the slavery would eventually fade away on its own, but that didn't happen. Instead, it became more entrenched, leading to greater conflicts in the years ahead. The Three-Fifths Compromise was just one of the many difficult choices made at the Constitutional Convention. The Founding Fathers were trying to hold the country together, balancing state interests, political power, and in some cases, their own contradictions. But the issue of slavery wasn't solved, it was just postponed. And as the nation grew, the divide between free and slave states only got deeper, eventually reaching a breaking point. For now, though, the delegates had crafted a constitution that was strong enough to last, but fragile enough to leave unresolved tensions. The next fight, convincing the states to accept it. The constitution was written, now it had to be ratified. And that's where the Federalists and Anti Federalists came in. The people who fought over whether this government should even exist at all. By the end of 1787, the Constitution was finally written. After months of debate, compromise, and political maneuvering, the delegates at the Constitutional Convention had created a new system of government, one that was meant to be strong but not too strong, flexible but not chaotic, powerful but still accountable to the people. But they weren't just designing a government for their own time. They were creating a framework that could last for generations, one that could adapt the changes as the country grew. That's why they included something the Articles of Confederation never had, a process for amendments, a way to fix problems without needing to start over from the scratch. Today, we will break down what the Constitution actually does, how it divides power, how it prevents any one person or a group from taking control, and how it can be changed over time. Because this wasn't just a document, it was a blueprint for a nation. One of the biggest lessons from the failure of Articles of Confederation was that the government needed structure. Under the Articles, there was only one branch, Congress, and it was powerless to enforce its own laws. The Constitution changed that by creating three separate branches of government, each with its own role. First, there's the legislative branch, which makes the laws. This is Congress, which was designed with two houses: the House of Representatives, where the states get seats based on population, and the Senate, where each state gets two votes, no matter its size. Then there is the executive branch, which enforces the laws. This is where the president comes in, acting as the head of the state, the commander in chief, and the person responsible for making sure government actually runs. But unlike a king, the president's power is limited by the Congress and the courts. And finally, there is the judicial branch, which interprets the laws. This is the Supreme Court and the federal court system, making sure laws follow the Constitution and don't violate people's rights. Each branch was carefully designed to check and balance the others, so no one person or group could gain too much power. Another major problem under the Articles was that the states had too much independence. They acted like separate countries, taxing each other's goods and ignoring national laws. The Constitution fixed this by dividing power between different levels of government. This system is called federalism, and it means that the power is shared between the national government or the federal government and the state governments. The federal government controls things like national defense and military, printing money, regulating trade between states and foreign countries. Meanwhile, the state governments handle things like education, police, fire departments, local roads, and infrastructure. And then there was a shared power list, like taxation and passing laws, where both the state and federal government play a role. The goal was to create a system where states still had control over their own affairs, but the federal government had enough power to keep the country united. At the heart of the Constitution is one key idea: popular sovereignty. That's just a fancy way of saying that the government gets its powers from the people. Unlike a monarchy, where a king or queen rules by divine right, the Constitution makes it clear the government exists because of the people allow it to exist. You can see this idea right in the first three words of the Constitution itself: We the people. Those three words weren't just for a show. They meant that this new government was fundamentally different from anything that had come before it. The people would have power to elect leaders, vote on laws through their representatives, petition the government when they disagree with it. And if the people wanted to change the Constitution itself, there was a system for that too. The founding fathers knew that no government would be perfect forever. That's why they built a way to change the Constitution without having to rewrite it completely. This is called the amendment process. To add a new amendment, you needed the approval from two-thirds of both houses of Congress, or the convention called by two-thirds of the states, which has never actually happened. Then the amendment had to be ratified by three-fourths of the states to officially become part of the Constitution. This system made it possible to adapt the government over time, but also made it difficult enough that amendments weren't passed too easily. Since 1787, the Constitution had been amended 27 times, with the first 10 amendments becoming what we now call as the Bill of Rights. The Constitution wasn't perfect, but it was built to last. By creating three branches of governments, dividing power between states and federal government, and allowing for amendments, it provided a structure that could grow with the country. But before any of this could become reality, there was one more hurdle. The Constitution had to be ratified by the states. And that wasn't going to be easy. Not everyone believed this new government was a good idea. Some feared it gave too much power to the federal government, while others thought it didn't protect the individual rights enough. This led to a huge political battle between the two groups, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. And that's what we will dive into next. The Federalists were the biggest supporters of the Constitution. To them, the Articles of Confederation had been an absolute disaster, weak, ineffective, and incapable of holding the country together. They believed that Without a strong national government, the United States would collapse into economic ruin and political infighting. Leading the charge were Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. To convince the public, they wrote a series of essays known as the Federalist Papers, arguing that the Constitution was not a threat to liberty but a way to protect it. They reassured people that this new system was not a monarchy, that it had checks and balances, and that it was designed to prevent any one person or branch from becoming too powerful. They believed a national army was necessary to defend against foreign threats, and that a unified economy would help the country grow. For the Federalists, this wasn't just about the government document, it was about securing the future of the nation. As always, not everyone was convinced. Across the country, a growing number of voices warned that the Constitution was dangerous. These people became known as the Anti Federalists. To them, this government looked too much like the British system they had just fought a war to escape. A powerful central government, a president who looked suspiciously like a king, and no specific protections for individual freedoms, these were all red flags. The Anti Federalists feared that this new government would become too far removed from the people. They wanted power to stay closer to home in hands of the states and local governments where leaders were more accountable to the people. The biggest issue, the Constitution had no Bill of Rights. There was nothing guaranteeing the freedom of speech, religion, press, or right to a fair trial. To them, a government without explicit protections for people was a government too dangerous to trust. And among those raising concerns were a woman who would become one of the most influential voices in the debate, Mercy Otis Warren. Mercy Otis Warren was no ordinary critic of the Constitution. She was a writer, a political thinker, and one of the first women in American history to publicly engage in political debate. Even before the revolution, she had used her pen as a weapon, writing plays and pamphlets mocking the British government. Now, with the Constitution on the table, she turned her attention to the dangers of too much federal power. She feared that the new government would eventually crush individual liberties, and she made her arguments clear in a widely read essay called The Observation on the New Constitution. In it, she warned that this new system lacked protections for people and could lead to a government ruled by wealthy elites. Her words carried weight. At a time when women were expected to stay out of politics, she stepped into the fight, challenging the most powerful men of her time. And she wasn't alone. Many people across the states began demanding that before the Constitution could be ratified, it needed a Bill of Rights. The Federalists and Anti Federalists fought bitterly over ratification. Some states quickly approved the Constitution, while others hesitated. The turning point came when the Federalists finally agreed to add a Bill of Rights, a series of amendments that would guarantee protections for individual freedoms. With that promise in place, the Constitution was officially ratified in 1788. The first 10 amendments, what we now call the Bill of Rights, were added in 1791, securing protections like freedom of speech, the right to bear arms, the protection against unlawful searches, and fair trials. The Anti Federalists didn't get everything they wanted, but they succeeded in forcing the new government to recognize individual rights, something that remains a core part of the Constitution today. And with that, the new government of the United States was born. But what actually is it in the Constitution? What do its articles say? And how does it function as a blueprint for the country? That's what we will explore in the next episode. Thank you for coming back and listening to this podcast. If you are a first timer here, I would recommend listening to the earlier episodes. A good perk to me would be you clicking the follow button, writing your feedback, and sharing this with your fellow friends and family. Your support and feedback means a world to me. Until next time, take care, stay curious, and keep exploring. Bye.